Good morning once again. Thank you for coming online for the 7th week of financial management. So it has been quite an interesting 2 weeks now. Last week we had a recorded session, and over the last 1 week, 7 days, there's been quite interesting developments. One was unfortunate that there's been a bit of a surge in the COVID-19 number of cases reported. Hopefully that will come under control soon. But other than that, on the financial front, well, actually, the market took a beating once this news was released. That is the stock market. But interestingly, what central bank did last week was they reduced interest rates. Policy rates were reduced, right? So central bank has two rates, the SDF and SLF. Right. So they have SDFR, standing deposit facility rate, and SLFR, which were at 5.5 and 6.5. Also the bank rate, which was going at 9.5. So these rates were reduced by 1% to 4.5, 5.5, and 8.5. Steep interest rate cut by the central bank. So, and what are the implications of a rate cut? Well, one is central bank, and the central bank effectively is trying to kickstart the economy, and they're expecting economic growth to slow down to about 1.5%. Now, for a country like Sri Lanka, which is still at a developing stage, slow growth is not going to help. So we need to grow at a faster pace. Now, one way is to boost credit growth. Private credit growth, the central bank had released some data indicating that private credit has shrunk during the last 1 month. The last couple of months because of COVID. Right, so to kickstart that and to boost private credit, they have reduced interest rates, which is a good move. Now, couple this with the liquidity infusion into the market. So there is enough of money in the market at low interest rates. So what we need to do as bankers, what banks need to do is to leverage on this, right, use the liquidity they have, also the deposit insurance scheme, which was introduced recently, and start lending at a low rate, at as low as possible. Right. So that's supposed to help the economic revival. It will hopefully accelerate economic revival, which is what all of us need. Okay, so now these are the benchmark interest rates in the country. Very important levels. SDFR is if a bank has surplus funds, now that is the net of deposits and loans. If they have a surplus, let's say they have deposits of 100, loans of, let's say, 90, then leaving 2 for, let's say, deposits of 100, loans 90, reserves 2, they end up at 92. They can place 8 in SDF, right? So if they place 8 in SDF, they will get a rate of 4.5% overnight, on an overnight basis. Now, if banks don't have liquidity, they let's say have lent out 105 to reserve, they will end up with 107, which is a shortfall of 7. So the shortfall will have to be bridged through SLF, right, which is at 5.5. They can borrow from central bank at 5.5. If banks are to use SLF, the only condition is they need to pledge securities, right? So it's like a repo. So SLF is like a repo facility. Whatever surplus securities or bills of bonds the bank has can be pledged and borrowed against, right? So it's like a repo facility. Remember, if banks borrow under SLF, they are subject to, not that they're subject to, but they'll take a hit on the liquid asset ratio, because it's like a repo. No? Whenever you do repos, your government securities will go out of the bank, so that the liquid asset ratio will take a hit, right? So if you are short of liquid asset ratio, this might not be a good tool. Then the bank rate is when the bank is desperate for funds, no one is willing to lend, they don't have securities to borrow, they can use the bank rate. Right? That's a clean facility. It does not affect the liquid asset ratio. You don't have to pledge securities. But in desperation, only a bank will use this rate. The number of times a bank has used this is very remote. Hardly, there are hardly any occasions when a bank has used the bank rate. To my knowledge, very, very few. Right, so there was an interest rate cut. The benchmark rates were cut. That's called monetary policy easing. Right. So to continue from where we stopped last week, we were at capital budgeting. Right. We discussed some of the concepts. Yeah, we did the weighted average cost of capital. Then we did independent and mutually exclusive events. This was during the recorded session, so I hope you all have gone through that. Independent means if you can select projects regardless of selecting another project, it's called an independent project. Mutually exclusive, if you select one, you can't select any other, right? Mutually exclusive. Then we did payback period. It's about how long it takes for you to recover your investment, payback. Right? It's a simple method to use. It calculates how long it takes to recover the cash, the investment. Only thing, it doesn't consider the entire cash flows received during the project, right? It only considers cash flows up to the payback period, not beyond that. So that's the weakness. It also does not discount cash flows. It doesn't consider time value of money. So to address the time value of money issue, we did what was called the discounted payback, right? So always remember that always discounted payback will be longer than payback. That is because discounted payback considers time value of money. And then we moved on to net present value, which is the present value of all future cash flows. That's called net present value. Right? This formula to calculate net present value is very important. I hope you all can remember it. And to accept a project, if projects are independent, you accept everything that has a positive net present value. Everything that gives a positive net present value needs to be accepted if they're independent. But if projects are mutually exclusive, you can only accept projects which give, you need to accept the project which gives the highest net present value. Right. So that's where we stopped last week. And let's move on to the next area. It's called internal rate of return. Right, internal rate of return. Now, just to recap, net present value And so let's go back a couple of slides. Okay, so let's look at project A. Draw the timeline. And the cash flows. Investment of 100. First year you receive 10. Second year you receive 60. And third year you receive 80. Right. Then if the discount rate, let's say, is 10%, you calculate the discounting factor at 10%. Right, which is 1 over 1 plus 10% to the power n. Here it is 1 over 1 plus 10% to the power 0, 1 over 1 plus 10% to the power 1, 1 over 1 plus 10% to the power 2, 1 over 1 plus 10% to the power 3. So your discounting factors are 1.9091. Find 8264. .7513. Then you calculate your present values, which is the cash flow into the discounting factor. Then your net present value is the total of all present values. Now you will get 18.779. That is your net present value when the discount rate is 10%. Now, using the knowledge that you have gained so far, what can you say if the interest rate is increased? What will happen to the net present value if interest rates are increased? If the interest rate or the discount rate goes from 10%, let's say, to 20%, then what happens? What happens if the discount rate is 20% and not 10%? What do you think? Will the net present value increase or will it reduce? Maybe you can type in your answers. Okay, Shian. Yes. Shian and guys, well, when you go for the exam, you should not use this kind of calculators. You can't use your phones, right? You can't use this. You need to use a financial calculator. So better invest in a financial calculator. or a scientific calculator? Now this one is cheaper. Financial calculator is quite expensive. So I would say this would do. Buy a scientific calculator, which is much cheaper, maybe around 2,000 bucks. You need to invest in this, and you also need to practice it. So when you go to office, you need to start using your scientific calculator. Stop using this kind of calculator for the next 6 months until you go for the exam. Right? And also, you need to go to bed with your calculator. Right? Literally, that's what you need to do. You need to be familiar with it. Yes, BA2 you can use. It's a financial calculator, but it is quite expensive, right? So it is quite a steep investment. Maybe a scientific calculator would do right now. But if you're going for further exams like CFA and all that, FRM, then you need to invest in a financial calculator, right? So for now, scientific calculator would do. Right. Yes, Naguleshwaran, you're right. When the discount rate increases from, let's say, 10%, if it goes up 20%, the net present value will drop, right? Okay, so now let's calculate the net present value when the discount factor is 20%. It's not 10, it's 21. Then what happens? How much do you get? 20% discount rate. Then calculate present values, you will get, which is your cash flow into discounting factor. 100, 8.333. So your net present value out of this. 3.707 negative. Right. So I hope all of us are on the same page. Now, how do you interpret these answers? At a discount rate of 10%, the present value of all the cash flows in this project is 18.779. And when the discount rate is 20%, the present value of all future cash flows in this project is a negative 3.707, right? So when it's 10%, when the discount rate is 10%, you get 18.779 positive. When it is 20%, it is negative 3.707. So if your weighted average cost of capital increases to 20%, your project will result in losses. You will not make a profit. It's not going to be a viable project. But if you can keep your weighted average cost of capital to 10%, then it is profitable, right? So I hope that is clear up to now. Yeah. Okay, so let's delete this. Discount rate. And net present value. At a discount rate of 10%, your net present value is 18.779. Then when the discount rate is 20%, it is negative 3.707 negative. So just out of curiosity, what do you think the discount, the net present value will be if the discount rate is 0%? What happens when the discount rate is 0%? What will be the net present value? What do you think? Right, I'll just put cash flows once again. Cash flows were 100 and 60 and 80. If the discount rate was 0%, right? What happens if the discount rate was 0%? What would the net present value be? What is the net present value? Can you quickly calculate? Anyone else? What is the net present value if the discount rate is 0%? Very good. Yes, Jalal, you're perfectly right. Perfect answer. When the discount rate is 0%, right? Remember, present value is the future value over 1 plus r to the power n, right? When r is 0, present value equals future value. Okay. So you don't have to do any calculations here. Present value is equal to future value. So all you have to do is you have to add these up, add each of the cash flows up, right? So it's minus 100, minus 90, minus 30, plus 50. At a discount rate of 0, it becomes 50. You don't have to calculate. No need to go through the entire calculation, right? Okay. If the examiner has not given you a clue, if he has not specifically mentioned anything, you can even take these two cash flows at 0% and at 20%, or at 0 and 10%, whatever cash flows you want. Right. Okay. For the time being, let's just take 10% and 20%. Now, if you look at these two discount rates and net present values, at 10% you are 18.7 plus, 20% you are negative 3.7. That means somewhere in between 10 and 20, you switch from a positive value to a negative value, right? So let's plug this on a diagram. So this is the net present value against your discount rate. At 10%, $18.779. Then at 20%, you're negative 3.707. Right? So you have 2 points on a graph. Positive 10%, you're 18.779. Negative 20%, you're negative 3.707. Now what you do is you need to draw a straight line connecting the 2 points. Right? It is straight, and it has to be straight. It may not look straight in this, but okay. Let me try that again. There you go. Right? It's a straight line connecting the 2 points. Right? So in this straight line, the straight line crosses from a positive region of net present value to negative. And at this point, what can you say about the net present value at this point? Say this is R. What is the net present value at R? Yes, the net present value turns 0 at this point. Now that is called the internal rate of return. This is IRR. The internal rate of return. The internal rate of return is the point at which is the rate at which, sorry, the internal rate of return is the discount rate at which the net present value is 0. Right? So the net present value turns 0 at the internal rate of return. When you discount your cash flows at the internal rate of return, your net present value becomes 0. That is what internal rate of return means. You need to remember the definition, right? It is the discount rate at which the net present value is 0. Yeah. So it's more or less the weighted average cost of capital where you will break even on a project. Yeah. Now, how do you find IRR? How can you find it? Well, in grade 2, when we did coordinates, you all can remember x and y axis, right? So let's write the coordinates of each of these points. Okay. So this is 10% and and 18.779. Here it is 20%. It is negative 3.707. Now the slope of a straight line, slope of the straight line is constant throughout. No? Yeah. And this is IRR, y is 0. Right? So these are the coordinates, 3 coordinates. Right? So for a straight line, can you all remember? But the straight line, the equation for a straight line is y equals mx. This is the slope. M is equal to y by x. Right? And for a straight line, wherever point you take, the slope is a constant. The tangent is a constant. The slope is a constant. Right? So this remains unchanged, which is what you are using here, the formula. Okay, so let's take these points. It's negative 3.707 minus 0 divided by 20 minus IRR is equal to, let's say, negative 3.707 minus 10 divided by 20 minus 10. Here it's minus 3.707 over 20 minus IRR is equal to minus 13.707 divided by 10. Right? So you need to cross multiply. Uh, 10 into 3.707 is negative 37.07. So let's bring this down. Divided by minus 0. Didn't. The IRR will be 20 minus 2.7, which is 17.3%. So the internal rate of return of this project is 17.3%, which means if your cost of capital increases to 17.3%, your net present value will end up at 0. You won't make a profit out of the project. That is what it means. That's what the internal rate of return means. Okay. So any questions up to now? Can't see half of the board. Which half can't you see? Pen. Now okay. Right. So the decision rule when it comes to IRR, like net present value, if it's positive, then you need to accept. What is the condition for IRR? If projects are mutually exclusive, you accept any project which has an internal rate of return greater than cost of capital. Right. So it's IRR is the internal rate of return. It's the return. Now return should be more than the cost, no? So if return is more than cost, you need to accept, right? Meaning if your internal rate of return is more than the cost, you can accept the project. So if projects are independent, you can accept any project which has an internal rate of return greater than cost of capital. But if projects are mutually exclusive, you go for the project which gives the highest IRR. That's how it works. Right. So when you do net present value and IRR calculations, you assume that all cash flows are being reinvested at the weighted average cost of capital. Right. That's why you discount all cash flows at the weighted average cost of capital, because you assume that all cash flows are being reinvested at the back. Right. And if the discount rate is equal to IRR, you assume that it's being invested at IRR. Now, what happens? I will skip a couple of slides for now. What happens if your cash flows are not normal? If they are non-normal? Right now, there are two kinds of cash flows. One is normal, other one is non-normal. Normal means you have an initial investment or an outflow followed by a series of inflows. Right? So there is an outflow that comes first, followed by a series of inflows. That means an investment followed by cash inflows. That's called a normal cash flow. It also can be the opposite. You can have a single inflow or a series of inflows followed by outflows. Right? So plus and minus does not interchange. If it is, it might start with minus and then move on to plus, or it might start with a plus and then go on to a minus. But they do not interchange. You don't get pluses and minuses coming in between randomly. Whereas if it's non-normal, you can have plus cash flows or negative cash flows, positive or negative cash flows coming alternative. Right? In between, you can have positive or a negative cash flow. That's called a non-normal cash flow. So normal cash flows are initial cash outflow followed by cash inflows, or vice versa. Inflows and outflows do not alternate. Right? So if you cannot have alternating cash flows if it's normal cash flow. Non-normal inflows and outflows can alternate. Costs may have to be incurred to terminate projects. That's an example. For example, you can have, like it says here, maybe an oil rig, right? So you have the initial setup cost and then it starts generating cash. But at the end of the project, it has to be dismantled and scrapped. Right? So you can have a series of an initial investment followed by a series of inflows, and at the end, there can be an outflow, a major outflow to dismantle the project. Right? something like this, for example. Now, the first year or the year 0, you have an initial investment. If you take the first cash flow, this one, right? Year 0, the first series of cash flows. Year 0, there is an outflow followed by a series of inflows. So it is a normal cash flow. Then you have an initial investment followed by inflows and then a final outflow. That's non-normal. Or you can have a series of outflows followed by a series of inflows. That's also normal. Even a series of inflows followed by a series of outflows is also normal. But if they keep alternating, then they are non-normal. Now, what happens if you have non-normal cash flows? You can get what is called a multiple IRR. Multiple IRR. That means not one IRR, but several IRRs, right? So, for example, in this project, you have an initial investment of 800 followed by a cash inflow 5,000, second year cash outflow 5,000. Right. Now, if you calculate IRR for this project, you will get two IRRs. One is at 25%, other one at 400%. Two IRR. That is called multiple IRR. For the simple reason that you are using a non-normal cash flow. If it was normal, this wouldn't have been the case. You would have only one IRR. Okay. So what you can do in such a situation is you can use what is called the modified internal rate of return. Modified IRR. The modified internal rate of return. Right. Modified IRR is used to address this weakness. What is the weakness? The weakness of having to deal with non-normal cash flows. That is the weakness. Now remember, the IRR model cannot handle non-normal cash flows. Not that it can't, it can, but it will generate, it will give you multiple IRRs, right? Not one, but many. So modified internal rate of return is the discount rate at which present value of terminal values is equal to the investment value. Now, what is a terminal value? Right. Terminal value. Right. Terminal value so let's say there is a 2-year project. Sorry, 3-year project. And let's say the first year gives a cash inflow of 100. You get a cash inflow of 100. Now, if your discount rate, let's say, is 10%, discount rate is 10%. These are the cash. This is the cash flow you're receiving in the first year. Now, this project terminates at the 3rd year, correct? So, if I may ask you, what is the value of this 100 equivalent at the end of the project or at the end of the 3rd year? How much is it? What is the equivalent of 100 received on first year at the end of the 3rd year, which is the termination of the project? Project is terminated at the end of the 3rd year. How do you calculate? Remember the future value formula is the present value into 1 plus r to the power n. Present value of 100 into 1 plus r is 10%. Power n. Now, what is n? N is the number of compounding periods. It is one compounding period and the second compounding. So n is 2. 1 plus r to the power 2. And you will get 100 into 1.21, which is 121. Right? So the present value is 100. Terminal value of this cash flow is, or the future value of this cash flow is 121. Now this future value is called the terminal value. The value of this cash flow when the project terminates. It's called terminal value. Okay. Then if you get a cash flow of 200 in the second year cash flow is 200. Terminal value of 200 at 10% is 200 into 1 plus 10%, the power 1, because you are compounding only for one period, it becomes 220. And third year, if you receive 300, the total of terminal values comes to 641. Okay, that is what we call the terminal value. This is the terminal value of the project. Right. That's called terminal value. Now let's say your investment is 300. Your investment is 300. Okay. And what modified internal rate of return says is this terminal value. If you discount at what rate? If you discount at the modified IRR, the present value of terminal value will be equal to the investment. Okay. The investment is 300, present value of terminal value is 641 divided by 1 plus MIRR, which means 1 plus MIRR is 641 divided by 300, the root. So MIRR is the cubic root of this minus 1. Okay. That gives you the modified IRR. Right. So I hope that is clear. Now, what it does is it pops one single figure, unlike IRR, which is called the modified internal rate of return. Right? So it addresses the complication that can arise if you have non-normal cash flows. Otherwise, if you have non-normal cash flows, the method to use is called modified IRR. Right? You can't use IRR. That is what you need to know. Okay, so getting back to the slides. Modified IRR is used to address the weakness of non-normal cash flows. It is the discount rate at which present value of terminal values is equal to investment. Terminal value is calculated by discounting terminal value at weighted average cost of capital. It is assumed that the reinvestments occur at WACC. You can accept independent projects if MIRR is more than the WACC, right? Because again, remember, it is a return. Modified IRR is the return. It has to be greater than your WACC if you are to accept a project, right? So your return should be more than the cost if you are to accept a project. For mutually exclusive projects, accept the ones with the highest MIRR. So if projects are independent, for as long as the modified IRR is more than the WACC, you can accept. But if they're mutually exclusive, you need to accept the one which gives the highest return. The highest return will be coming from the highest MIRR. Yes, that's the decision rule. Right, so let's work on this example, the modified IRR calculation. Right, so these are the cash flows. First step is to calculate the terminal values, right? So terminal values as of the third year. And the discount rate is 10%. Right. So the terminal value of the cash flow you get in the second year, you're compounding it for 1 year, will be 60 into 1 plus 10%, power 1, which is 66. Then 10 you need to compound for 2 years, it will be 10 into 1 plus 10% to the power 2. You get 12.1. So the total terminal value $158.1. And your investment is 100. So what MIRR says is the present value of terminal values the discount rate at which present value of terminal value is equal to investment. Discount rate at which present value of terminal value is equal to the investment. You need to discount it for 3 years, a period of 3 years. So your MIRR will be 1.581. It's 158.1 divided by 100 is 1.581. Cubic root minus 1. $16.5. Ezra, why are we taking first year's n equals to first year's n? Where are we taking this? Here. This one. That is because you need to find the terminal value, right? Terminal value. That means how much is this 10 going to be after 2 years? What is the equivalent of 10 when the project terminates, right? So the first year you're getting 10, how much is it equivalent to when the project terminates? If you get it in the third year, how much should you receive? If you are not receiving it here, what you are receiving at the termination of the project, how much should you receive instead of the 10? Okay, that's the future value calculation. Can you remember what we did? Future value is present value 1 plus r to the power n. You need to use that formula, which is what I have used here. Okay, the terminal value of the first year's cash flow is the present value of 10 into 1 plus 10% to the power 2, because it's compounding for a period of 2 years. 2-year compounding period. That is why you put 2 here. Whereas the 60 gets compounded only for 1 year. 60 gets compounded only for 1 year, only from the second to the third year. Okay, so I hope that's clear. Any more questions? Fine, so let's move on. Yeah, so modified IRR is 16.5%. Benefits of MIRR compared to the internal rate of return. Modified internal rate of return reasonably assumes that cash flows are reinvested at WACC. It eliminates the issue of multiple IRR. So that's the main benefit, right? It eliminates the issues that you might have of multiple IRR, because it does not generate multiple IRR. It only gives one IRR. Okay, so let's do these cash flows, this example. Let's try this one. Practice. Year 0 has an investment of 800,000. First year has an inflow of 5,000. Second year has an inflow of, an outflow of 5,000. And the compound rate is 10%. Now the exam, this is one thing you could do. Try and use shortcuts, but do it the correct way. Don't make mistakes. That's what I did. I eliminated the thousands. Try and use shortcuts, but don't make mistakes. Okay. So you have these cash flows. You need to calculate terminal value. Terminal value is 5,000 into 1 plus 10% to the power 1, which is 5,500. You end up with 500. Right. So this series of cash flows is normal cash flows or non-normal cash flows? It is non-normal cash flows because you get an outflow followed by inflow and again an outflow. So it's not normal. Okay. Yes. Sorry. Mistake. Mistake, but you can't take the net, no? Your terminal value is 5,500. Right. What is the present value of all outflows? You need to calculate present value of all outflows. So this is 5,000 divided by 1 plus 10% power 2. Okay, it's negative. $4,132 negative, right? So the present value of outflows is minus 800 plus 4,132 is 4,932 minus. Right. So the present value of all outflows should be equal to the terminal value, present value of terminal value when you discount at MIRR. Okay. When you discount at MIRR, the present value of all outflows should be equal to the present value of the terminal value. So MIRR 5,000 divided by 4,932 square root minus 1. Correction, it's not 5,000, it's 5,500. So MIRR is 5.6%. Okay. So you look at all the outflows, get the present value, and then the terminal, calculate the terminal value. Okay. And when you discount at modified IRR, the present value of all terminal values should be equal to the present value of outflows. Right. So it gives you one MIRR of 5.6. Now your cost of capital is 10%, right? Your cost is 10, your return is 5.6. 10% cost, return 5.6. Do you accept or reject? You need to reject. And that is the decision point. Why? Because your return is less than the cost. You will make losses. You can't go ahead. Right, so I hope that was clear. Modified IRR. Okay. So what you need to know is, if cash flows are normal, you can use IRR. If non-normal cash flows, use modified IRR. Sorry, I can't understand your question. N equals 0. What do you mean? Where? Year 2, N is equal to 0. Why? No, because you need to calculate the terminal value. No? The terminal value of all inflows. There's only one inflow, so you're calculating the future value of this inflow. Right? You're in fact compounding it for 1 year, from the first to the second year. So that's 1 year compounding. Okay. You're compounding it only for one period. No? So it's the present value into 1 plus R to the power 1. That is why you get 5,500, which is the terminal value of inflows. Cash flow and terminal value at the same year for the first year. No. The first year's cash flow is the only inflow. So it has to be, you have to calculate the terminal value of all inflows. Like terminal value, there is only one inflow. Of that, this inflow is 5,500 at 10%. Right. Any more questions on modified IRR? So remember, we did payback, discounted payback, net present value, internal rate of return, and modified internal rate of return. Okay. And all of these you used cash flows. Cash flows and not profits. If you use profits, it is called the accounting rate of return. So these are cash flow based techniques, not profits, but cash flows. That is what you need to know. If you are using profits, it's called accounting rate of return. So these are cash flow based techniques. Okay, so let's move on. Right, so the next area, if you have two projects, right? One is a 2-year project, the other one is a 4-year project. 2-year project has cash flows of 60 in each of the years, and the 4-year project has cash flow of 33.5 in the 4 years. Now, if this was the case, which project will you accept if the two projects are, say, mutually exclusive? Will you take on S or L? What are your answers? L. Okay. Why? Reason? Why will you prefer L? L has a higher NPV. Okay, good. S. 100, 60 and 60. The discounting factor is at 10%. S has a net present value of 4.13. Right. What about L? Cash flows of L. Investment of 100, and then throughout you get 33.5. Now, a series of identical cash flows received over a period of time is called an annuity. Right? So if you remember the annuity formula, you can use it straight away. Otherwise, you can also use the traditional way of calculating present value, 100. You get an NPV of 6.18. Right? So, Gerald, you're right. Spot on. L has a higher net present value. So, yes, you should accept L. But what if there is a complication? Right? What if I say that these are ongoing projects? It's not just a one-night stand or a one-off thing. What if these projects continue? You just don't want to take your capital out. You need to keep investing. Then what do you do? Will your answer change or will it be the same? What if these are ongoing projects? Then what do you do? Because the complication is because S is a 2-year project, L is 4 years, right? So if it was just a one-off thing, you would have gone for the highest NPV project. But if this is recurring, a recurring project, right? So S you have to keep reinvesting every 2 years, and you have to keep reinvesting every 4 years. Then how do you compare the two? Will the dynamics change or still you go by the same basis? Actually, the dynamics will change, right? What will happen is S will not stop here. Right, S will not stop at the end of the second year. It will extend beyond that. Which means at the end of the second year, you will get another investment. Right? So I'll remove this again. This is the reinvestment. End of the second year, you're reinvesting 100. Then you're getting 60-60. Right? So you're reinvesting 100 means second year your cash flows will be 60 minus 100 is minus 40. So your present values should be 100 negative 54 point. Sorry, this is negative, right? Yeah, 40 minus 1. NPV of 7.55. Okay, whereas the NPV of L was 6.18. Now what happens? S has a higher NPV than L. Isn't it? Right, so it changes the dynamics completely. Okay, so these are the cash flows. You net them off and recalculate net present value. Okay. Right, so any questions up to now? No questions, we can move on. Now, choosing the optimal capital budget. If you have a limited amount of capital, should you optimize the budget? Yes, because your capital is limited. It's a limited resource, which means you need to make maximum use. So to optimize your capital budget, you invest in all projects if net present value is greater than 0. If you have positive net present value, you invest if you have unlimited capital, right? So unlimited capital, if you have access to unlimited amounts of capital, you can invest in any project which gives positive NPV. Right? That means it will generate profits. Whereas if it gives negative NPV, that means you will not get, you will start losing money. So you should not invest in projects which give negative NPV. That is from a purely a financial point of view. There are non-financial factors as well which you need to consider. You may have to consider. If capital is limited, invest only in selected projects, right? So if limited capital, you invest in the most efficient projects. In this case, either increase marginal cost of capital or use capital rationing. So marginal cost of capital is the cost that needs to be incurred in order to raise an additional unit of capital, marginal cost. Right? The cost that has to be incurred in order to raise an additional unit of capital, marginal cost of capital. Or you can use capital rationing. Capital rationing. That means you can pick and choose where you are going to invest. You ration your capital. Marginal cost of capital should be used if it is expensive to raise external capital, right? And if it increases the risk of investors. Okay, so for example, if you have busted all of your lines with banks, then what is the cost of raising maybe debentures, right? Or raising funds through an IPO, something like that. Capital rationing. It's required because investments are not made in all projects, which results in a positive NPV. Capital rationing is required because investments are not made in all projects, which result in positive NPV. Now, not every project is positive, right? It doesn't give positive NPVs. Upper limits are imposed on future investments. Okay, so a project that may be positive today might turn negative sometimes down the line. So you need to have enough leverage where you can invest in projects which might be profitable in the future. And you need to ration your capital because it's a limited resource and you need to optimize the utilization of capital. That means you can't just blindly invest in projects. You have to invest in projects which gives the highest return and then come down the order if you have additional capital. Reasons for optimizing capital budgets, it's to reduce direct and indirect cost of raising capital, right? So raising capital is an expensive exercise. Cannot be done all the time. Because, for example, if you want to raise debentures, you need to have a discussion with an investment house, and there are certain fees that are going to be levied, right? Like management fees, maybe placement fees. So all that has to be borne. It's a costly exercise to raise capital, which means you have to optimize the cost, try and reduce cost, and also make use of whatever capital that you already have. Right. The next one is called the profitability index. Profitability index. It is the ratio between present value of future cash flows to the initial investment. Right. So the present value of future cash flows divided by your initial investment. Remember, it is not net present value divided by investment, but the present value of future cash flows divided by your investment. Now, if you can remember how to calculate net present value, right? It is net present value calculation. For example, in this project, net present value is the present value of all of these cash flows. So if you take the profitability index for this project, it will be the addition of to reduce the complication. I will, but let's stick to this. Right. The present value of the future cash flows, which is 107.55 divided by your investment of 100. Okay. Present value of future cash flows is 54.546 plus minus 33 plus 45 plus 40 comes to 107 divided by your investment of 100, right? So your profitability index comes as 1.07. 1.07. In this case, the profitability index is more than 1. If your profitability index is more than 1, that means you are dividing the present value of future cash flows by the net present value. Sorry, by the investment. More than one. That means total present values will be more than your investment. Which also means your revenues will be more than your investment. If your revenue is more than the investment, you make profits. Okay, so the decision rule when it comes to profitability index is profitability index should be more than 1 for you to invest. And if profitability index is more than 1, you can invest. Otherwise, it is not feasible. So advantages of profitability index, it is similar to net present value, right? The calculations are all similar. Calculations are all similar. And you can compare projects with different sizes, right? So now, for example, what if you had two projects, S and L again, and this was, let's say, in thousands, right? This was in thousands. This project was in billions. L was in billions. S was in thousands. Then how can you compare the two projects? S is a small investment, L a massive investment. How can you compare the two? That is why profitability index becomes useful. It makes projects more comparable. Okay, because it removes the distortion of size. Regardless of the size, you can compare two projects. Now, if you had used these two to calculate present values, present value of S would have been in thousands. Present value of L would have been in billions. And so this would have been in 1,000, here billion. Right? So it's very difficult to compare the two. Very different performance levels, different sizes, difficult to compare. On the face of it, L might look more profitable. But you can remove the distortion of size if you use profitability index because it gives a ratio. Right? The ratio of all your inflows to your investment. So this removes the distortion of size, profitability index. Okay, so I hope that was clear. Disadvantages, it's still similar to NPV. Right? It gives a relative profitability and not absolute terms. Now, if you're given only profitability index, if you are not given the NPV figures, then it is difficult to make a decision, right? Because if there are two projects, if you are given no other information but profitability index figures, one project, let's say, had a profitability index of 1.2. Another project had a profitability index of 1.5. Now, out of these two, which one is better for you? Which one is more suitable? If that was the only information that was given, it's very difficult for you to take a call. You can't, right? Why? Because you only have a relative figure, only a profitability index figure. You don't know how big the projects are, right? Okay, so that is capital budgeting done. Do we have any questions on capital budgeting? No questions on capital budgeting? Right, so it means two things. Either you have understood everything or you have not understood anything. Okay, so no questions, we can move on. Let's move on to business valuations. Right. Valuation of a business. Right. Now, why is valuation important? Why do you need to value a business? Well, the simplest case, right? When you're granting a housing loan, one of the first things you will do is, after checking the titles, you might do a valuation of the land. Now, how do valuers calculate the value of a land? How do they estimate the value of a land? Based on so many factors, right? It's based on where the land is located, the surrounding areas, access to the land, and all those factors, right? So they might use what is called relative valuation. Relative valuation compared to the next door property or land that was sold recently. How much is this one worth? It's called relative valuation, right? Or there can be absolute valuation methods also. So absolute valuation means you look at the property, you look at use your judgment, your expert opinion, and estimate a value for that. Right. So absolute and relative valuation. Now, why do you need to value land or an asset? Why would you do it? So if you come across a decision where you have to buy maybe a vehicle, right? Then how do you judge the value of a vehicle? Why is it important that you know the value of the vehicle? Now, for example, if you were to buy, say you wanted a motorbike, right? Or a three-wheeler or whatever. You wanted to buy it for some reason. And you go to the market, you see a beautiful three-wheeler, brand new, priced at 10 million bucks, right? 10 million bucks, the three-wheeler. Will you jump and buy it at once? You will not, isn't it? Why not? Why? It's a brand new three-wheeler, 10 million bucks, zero mileage, worth 10 million, right? That's all you have to pay, only 10 million. Why won't you buy it? No, no one will buy it. It's not worth it. Okay, very good. Then what if you want to buy a car? You see a brand new BMW, right? 2020 BMW in perfect working condition, zero mileage, priced at 1 million rupees. Will you buy it? Yes. So why don't you buy the three-wheeler at 10 million, and why would you buy a BMW at 1 million? Why is that? Why different reactions? Okay, so what drives the price of the BMW and also the three-wheeler? One thing is perception, because you guys with your egos, right? You don't want to go in a three-wheeler, you want to go in a BMW, right? So one thing is that you have attached value to an intangible asset, right? It's perception, maybe something more than that. The brand, it's how you perceive the brand, the top of mind recall of the brand, the prestige that is attached to it. So many factors go into the decision making process. You don't look at only the price. No, the three-wheeler may not be a premium product. It is an inferior product in your view. Exactly, Gerald. That is you hit the nail on the head. So it's where you position this product that really matters, right? So part of it is something to do with the brand, then the safety aspects, features, performance of the vehicle. So many things that come into mind. And ultimately, based on how you perceive the asset, you will make a decision whether you should buy or whether you should not. Right? So in the same way, let's say you have two vehicles at home. One is a brand new Mercedes-Benz. The other one is a three-wheeler. Okay? Right? So remember, the first option was to buy. Which one will you buy? Will you buy the BMW at 1 million, or will you buy a three-wheeler at 10 million? Now, if the prices were reverse, right? If the three-wheeler was trading at say 500,000 bucks and the BMW was going at 15 million bucks, then you would have made a different decision, right? Your decision may have been different. You might still be willing to go for a BMW at 15 million, and you might not buy the three-wheeler at 500,000. But what if you had two vehicles at home, a brand new BMW or a Mercedes and a brand new three-wheeler, right? So one fine day, let's say someone comes to you and wants the three-wheeler. Right? He is asking for the three-wheeler at a price of 10 million. You already have it with you. You love the three-wheeler. A friend of yours wants the three-wheeler and he's willing to pay 10 million bucks for the three-wheeler. Now, will you sell it to him, or will you keep it with you? Will you keep the three-wheeler with you? What will you all do? Yes, you close your eyes and you sell it, right? But what if the same friend asks for the brand new BMW at 1 million bucks? Will you give it to him? You will not, right? Okay. You might not give it to him, right? So based on the price level, you might either make a decision to buy, or you might decide to sell, or you might decide not to do anything at those prices, isn't it? So why such a change in behavior? All because of price. That is because you have attached a certain value to the asset. There is an asset value that you have already attached to it. Now, for example, the three-wheeler. Maybe you might have attached a value of 500,000 bucks, right? You might, in your mind, your head, you feel the asset is worth 500,000 bucks. So if someone comes and offers you 10 million bucks for that asset, which you thought was worth only 500,000, you will jump and give it to him, right? That is because you thought the asset is worth only 500,000, but I'm getting a better deal at 10 million. On the other hand, if you thought the asset was worth only 500,000, you have to pay 10 million bucks to buy it, you will not buy it, right? Because you will feel you're getting a raw deal. You're buying an asset which is not worth the value. Yeah. So likewise, the price and value are two different things, isn't it? The price is the amount that you're going to pay, right? Or that you receive. But the value is how much it is worth to you. Now, on top of brand perception, there might be other sentimental values also, right? So maybe the three-wheeler is something that your girlfriend gave to you, or your boyfriend gave to you, or maybe the next door neighbor gave you, something like that. There's some sentimental value attached to it, right? So no matter how much you receive, the value of the three-wheeler might be much more than the amount of money that you receive, right? Now, for example, there are people who are not willing to sell ancestral homes because they feel this is where my great-great-great-grandfather lived. I'm not going to sell it. Right? My great-great-grandfather lived here, then my grandfather lived here, my father was here, and I also have to be here. So it might be at the heart of Colombo, but no way I'm going to sell. Right? Someone comes and gives you 10 billion bucks, I'm not going to sell it. Right? That is because it has more value than the price, isn't it? But to an outsider, offering 10 billion for that property might seem to be a fortune, but not to that person. Okay. So value can change, but the price will not change in the similar manner. So price and value are two different things, two different aspects. Both are very important when it comes to a purchasing or a selling decision. You don't go by price, you will usually go by value. And so you will buy something which you feel is cheap. Right? That means you will offer an amount of money and purchase it if you see more value in it than the money that you're offering. In any purchase decision, that is the case, right? Likewise, you will sell an asset if you feel you're receiving more money than what it is worth. Right? That is valid for any sale decision also. So purchases and sales will be done based on value, not on the monetary amount, not on the face value of the currency note that you're receiving. It will be done purely based on the perceived value. Right? So remember that. And this is the famous quote by one of the best investors in the world, Warren Buffett. He says, price is what you pay and value is what you get. Perfect and fantastic statement, isn't it? Because the price you will pay, but you will receive the value. Yeah, so that's why you're willing to pay 1 million bucks for a brand new BMW, which you feel is worth a lot more. Now, by driving the BMW, you get prestige. Maybe it's all in your head, right? You drive a BMW from your home to your office. Right? It takes maybe half an hour. Then you drive a three-wheeler and go from your home to office. Same half an hour, maybe less. Everything in between is all in your head. Whether it's a BMW or a three-wheeler, there are various aspects that go into it, into the decision-making process, something like prestige, right? Well, it might be the ability to relate to your peers. Everything is in your head, right? And also the same BMW might be worth to you, but there might be another guy who does not really like BMWs. Maybe he likes Benz. So you offer him a BMW at $1 million, he might not be willing to buy because he prefers a Benz, not BMW, right? So the same asset to different people might have different values. Humans buy only when they get more than they pay. Okay, so you need to get more than what you pay if you are going to buy. So value investing. It involves buying securities that appear underpriced by some form of fundamental analysis. Now, this is what we are going to touch base on next week, right? Value. Not on the price, but also value. An important concept. Now, this is purely based, this is what drives the market, value. Value drives markets. Very important concept, which we will discuss next week. And unfortunately, next week will also be a recorded session, right? So the continuation will be a recorded session. If you have any questions, you can direct it to me the week after. So 18th will be a recorded session. And we will meet once again on the 25th through a live session, right? So I hope everything was clear for today. Thank you very much for coming online, and enjoy the day. Have a great week and stay safe. Thank you. All the best. How to access the recorded session? Well, you might have to check with the office. I think it is there in the classroom. Just check with the IBSL office. They will let you know how to access recorded versions. All right, guys. Thanks.